So you're a small group leader or maybe even an elder at your church, and you're beginning a series on the Gospels. And in your first session, somebody says to you, my professor at college says there's a problem with the Gospels. Do you know what he's talking about? Or maybe you're even a college student and you're taking a course called Christianity 101. And in the first lesson, your professor starts talking about the Synoptic Problem. And at the end of the lecture, he or she concludes, since the Gospels are from anonymous sources, they're not really trustworthy. Therefore, you shouldn't take them too seriously. And you're wondering, is that true? Well, stick around for a few minutes and we'll provide you with some answers to those important questions. Be back in just a second. Hey, thanks for sticking around. This is AskABibleProf.com, where we give you straightforward answers to your questions about the Bible and Christianity. And today we're talking about the Synoptic Problem and source criticism. So to begin with, we'll give you some brief definitions. And then afterwards, we'll give you additional information that explains why it's important for you to be able to address these important topics. So with that in mind, let's get started. So let's begin with some definitions. First, the Synoptic Problem. The Synoptic Problem is a question concerning the literary relationship between the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, which as a group are commonly referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. More specifically, the Synoptic Problem seeks to answer the question of which Synoptic Gospel was composed first, and what, if any, literary dependence do the later Gospels have upon it and one another. So you should know that this is not a new question. This is a question that the church has dealt with for centuries. Even Augustine wrote about this very question, and he wrote about the particular order that he believed the Gospels were written in and the relationship between them and how they depended upon one another. So this is not like a new question. This is a question the church has been dealing with for centuries. However, there are some who enjoy, implying that there's a problem with the Gospels. They tend to be skeptics and people who have a bias against the Bible and Christianity. And so they like to allow people to infer that the Gospels have a problem, therefore they're not trustworthy. And that's not what the Synoptic Problem is all about. The Synoptic Problem is just a question of which Gospel was written first, and what, if any, literary dependence do either of the Gospels have upon one another. So that's why a lot of evangelical scholars are beginning to refer to this topic as the Synoptic question, not the Synoptic Problem, because it's not a problem. It's just trying to seek a solution to the question of which Gospel was written first, and what, if any, literary dependence do the later Gospels have upon that first Gospel as well as with one another. So when you're interacting with people and trying to teach them about this subject, you should probably try to discern first, is this a person who's skeptical and biased, and they really don't want an answer? They just like the idea of giving Christians a hard time. And then there might be other people who just are not sure about what the question really is, and they're just seeking to find out an answer to this very easy question. And so for those people, you should try to assure them and help them understand it's really a question, not a problem. And the question is this: which Gospel was written first, and what, if any, literary dependence do the later Gospels have upon it and with one another? So having defined the Synoptic Problem, now let's define source criticism. In a recent publication, source criticism was defined in this manner. Source criticism is the discipline devoted to discerning the underlying literary sources of a given document. And that's fine. It's a very generic definition and very good. But let's provide a definition that's more appropriate to gospel research. Source criticism is an investigative tool used while researching the composition stage of the canonical Gospels with the goal of ascertaining what, if any, written sources the author used as he wrote his respective Gospel. So those are some good definitions, and we should be able to work with those as we're discussing the topic of source criticism. But there are a few things you should keep in mind as we're discussing this subject. First of all, Source criticism is not only applied to gospel research. It's applied throughout biblical research, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Secondly, it's not just applied to biblical research. It's often applied to other areas of ancient literary research. And maybe very interestingly, source criticism is not just applied to ancient literary research. It's even used in areas of modern research. Matter of fact, the FBI uses principles and techniques of source criticism in order to investigate modern documents and attempt to try to ascertain what's the original, what is a common literary source, and what is a copy and what is a forgery. So you need to keep these things in mind. Specifically, you need to realize that in certain situations and in certain contexts, source criticism can be a very useful tool. It's not just a billy club that skeptics use to beat up Christians. At times it can be very helpful and very important. So you need to keep that in mind when you're thinking about source criticism. And you also need to keep in mind it's not just for biblical research. It's for research in many different areas of ancient literature, as well as modern literature and modern documents as well. So those are some things you should probably keep in mind as you're thinking about the subject of source criticism. So those are some definitions and some important details you might need with respect to how to understand the synoptic question. But some of the things I've said may have raised for you some red flags and some questions, and so I want to address a few of those. The first concerns the issue of plagiarism. And this is interesting. This is rather a modern concern because, with modern copyrights laws, a lot of people are of the impression that, well, you just said that the gospel writers plagiarize from one another, and plagiarism is wrong. How can that be? Well, as I said, that's kind of a modern concern given our modern laws about the rights to what we print. But in ancient history, whether in Christian or in pagan history, there was no such thing as copyright laws. So it was not a big deal for other authors, whether Christian or pagan, to use the material previously written by other people. In fact, instead of seeming inappropriate and wrong, it was actually kind of a way to demonstrate that you were an educated person because you could quote other authors and you could demonstrate that you're familiar with what they wrote by employing it in your own writing. So for ancient audiences, if you just sat down and wrote everything you would think on a particular topic, they would look at that and say, well, that's not very educated because you've not interacted with what previous scholars wrote. So as ancient historians would write, sometimes they would refer to previous historians, but other times they wouldn't refer to them at all, but they would just embed in their own history large portions of what previous historians have written. And that was a way of demonstrating that you're educated on the subject and you have further insight into that subject. So you have to try to realize that for ancient writers, whether Christian or not, plagiarism was never a concept they ever were concerned about. And that is a modern concern because of our modern copyright laws. And in academic circles today, it's inappropriate to copy people and imply that it's your own work. But ancient authors never even really thought about those things. So that's something you should keep in mind. So a second concern may be that if you believe the gospel writers may have depended upon one another for their materials and copied one another, then somehow that implies that someone doesn't believe in the inspiration of the Holy Spirit in the composition of the Gospels. Well, that's not accurate. That's not actually true. The fact that one gospel writer may have been led by the Holy Spirit to depend and use material from another gospel writer who was equally inspired by the Holy Spirit does not challenge the doctrine of inspiration. Now, for some, it may make them feel better to think that each gospel writer sat in a room by themselves and individually composed by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit separate documents that, for whatever reason, look an awful lot like one another. Now, that may make you feel better about the doctrine of inspiration, and if it does, that's fine. But it's not a challenge to the doctrine of inspiration to assert that the Holy Spirit inspired one gospel author to employ the work of a previous gospel author whose work was equally inspired by the Holy Spirit. So, given the practices of ancient authors and the reality that it's not wrong for the Holy Spirit to inspire some gospel writers to depend upon what other gospel writers wrote, the concept of source criticism and literary interdependence between the synoptic gospels is not really a threat to the doctrine of inspiration. Now, some may think it is, but in reality, it's not. So that should not be a concern. A third concern I want to address is those who assert that, this is really not important. This doesn't prevent somebody from becoming a devoted follower of Jesus Christ. Matter of fact, it may do more harm than good. Well, the problem with that kind of perspective is this. The bell of skepticism has already rung. There's no unringing that bell. And a lot of people send their kids to college, or a lot of people have attended extremely liberal churches, and there are people in those churches and at universities around the world and around this country who get great joy in questioning the veracity of the Gospels. And source criticism is a tool they love to beat up Christians with. And so a lot of times parents send their kids to college, or Christians come from liberal churches, and they've been indoctrinated with this topic. So ignoring the topic doesn't really help you prepare your people when the topic arises. It's out there, it's going to arise, and if you just ignore it, then you're actually cheating yourself on how to effectively equip believers, people who are serious about being devoted to Jesus Christ. You're actually cheating yourself out of helping them address those questions. Because the problem is, people will have those questions. People will say, like in my opening, I had a university professor who said, there's a problem with the Gospels. Do you know what he means? Well, you just simply looking at that student or that person and saying, it's wrong for you to think about that, and you shouldn't think that way, doesn't change their doubts, doesn't erase their question. It just tells them you don't like the question. So what you really need to do is seek down inside yourself and ask yourself this question. If I'm afraid of that question, or am I willing to do the hard work that is necessary in order to learn about the question and then effectively answer the questions of those who may have doubts? Because that's what being a shepherd is. It's protecting the flock. And you can't protect a sheep by simply asserting, it's wrong for you to think about that question. Because you know what? That doesn't really answer the question. And it tells the people asking those questions, you don't really care about their concerns, and you don't have an answer for their doubts. So asserting that this is not an important topic is really not a well-defended assertion. And you need to equip yourself so you can help the people in your congregation find rational, well-argued, and believable answers to the questions that they have. So that's a brief introduction to the synoptic problem and source criticism and why they are so important. If you appreciated the video, hit like. Again, this is AskABibleProf.com. I'm Dr. Monty Shanks, and may the Lord richly bless you and all those you love as you seek to magnify Him and increase His glorious kingdom. Thanks for watching, and God bless.